And to others, I represent how to do it. To some, they say, how the hell can she be alive? Why is this woman alive?
Picture this, Grace Slick, that electrified voice of acid-drenched anthems and unapologetic rebellion, sitting alone in a dim room, red wine in hand, shadows dancing across her face. Her eyes, sharp, unblinking, don't flicker when she finally breaks the silence. Her laugh isn't amused, it's bitter, cold, a warning shot. She doesn't hold back, never did, but now, decades after the psychedelic fog has lifted and the banners of peace have yellowed with age, she's done with keeping the peace. She's ready to name names, and not out of bitterness, but reckoning. 16s were supposed to be about revolution, about tearing down the walls. But what Grace saw behind those walls were not just gods with guitars. They were cowards in costume. Some broke promises. Some broke people. And a few? They broke the music. Crushed it under ego, addiction, and commercial rot. And now, she's dragging them out of the shadows. One by one. The first name she doesn't hesitate to bring up is one that still divides fans, Jim Morrison. It might shock fans who romanticize their chaotic brilliance, but Grace never bought into the myth of Morrison. To her, he wasn't a poet, he was a narcissist. While others called him the Lizard King, she called him a liability. She saw through the leather pants, through the drunken howls on stage. They shared the same wild stages in the late 16s, but Grace watched as Jim collapsed into spectacle. His performances weren't brave, they were wasted. Where others saw tortured genius, Grace saw ego hiding behind excess. She respected the Doors' music, but not the man who hijacked every moment to feed his own mythology. But if Morrison represented excess, the next name was a wound that cut much closer to home. Paul Kantner. This one stung deeper, because they once made magic together. Co-founders of Jefferson Airplane, co-pilots of the counterculture. But behind the psychedelic harmonies was a slow brewing war. Paul, to Grace, became everything they'd fought against. Controlling, stubborn, unwilling to let the band evolve. Their creative differences turned personal. Studio sessions ended in shouting matches. Love songs turned into coded barbs. Even as lovers, their bond was soaked in resentment. What enraged her most wasn't his ambition, it was his fear. Fear of change. Fear of letting her voice rise higher. And as the band shifted, so did the balance. Grace wanted revolution. Paul wanted control, and in the end, their ideals clashed louder than their guitars. The bitterness she felt with Kantner was tangled in intimacy.
Because it also allowed me, the home in which I grew up, allowed me to develop imagination. Because we did not have television. They listened to one radio program called The Halls of Ivy with Ronald.
But the next name, David Crosby, stirred something colder, disgust. To the outside world, David Crosby was a harmony wizard. But to Grace, he was arrogance in fringe and feathers. Their paths collided during the golden years of Laurel Canyon's mythical rise, where folk rock stars lounged barefoot in sunlit living rooms, and where egos expanded as quickly as the smoke from their joints. At first, she approached Crosby with cautious admiration. His reputation as a vocal innovator intrigued her. But that intrigue turned to anger during their first recording session together. Grace laid down a raw vocal track, experimental and edgy. Crosby listened, scoffed, and dismissed it with a smirk. In front of everyone, the room went quiet. Grace went cold. What followed were months of friction. Every time they crossed paths, whether at a festival, a radio panel, or a shared dinner, they clashed. He'd interrupt her ideas, undermine her stories, joke about her lyrics like she was a novelty act. One night at a party in Topanga Canyon, he loudly claimed that female voices lacked the spiritual weight of male singers. Grace left in fury, throwing her drink in a nearby bush and swearing never to share another mic with him. Crosby, in Grace's eyes, believed he was untouchable. Worse, he believed she was replaceable. To him, her presence in rock was a curiosity. To her, his condescension was violence wrapped in velvet. In a scene where men ruled with soft voices and loud pride, Crosby's superiority complex was the final straw. Grace didn't need approval, but she demanded respect, and Crosby never gave it. And for that she carried the grudge like a war medal, proof that even within peace and love, the battle lines were real. Just when she thought the rock scene had revealed all its illusions, along came someone she couldn't stand from the very first handshake, Gene Simmons. From the moment she met him, Grace felt it, that suffocating air of manufactured masculinity. Simmons wasn't rock to her. He was theater dressed in arrogance, a walking billboard for excess, a caricature of rebellion wrapped in layers of ego and market-tested bravado. He didn't bleed music, he sold it like a product, and worse, people bought it. She didn't hate Kiss for their theatrics, she hated them for turning rebellion into a brand, for turning grit into glitter. She watched in disbelief as fans threw themselves at a spectacle that had no soul, only smoke machines and marketing campaigns. But it wasn't just the show, it was the treatment. The way girls were handled like props, how backstage felt like a hunting ground rather than a sanctuary for art. Simmons, with his leering gaze and predatory charm, seemed to wear misogyny like face paint, and he never took it off. Grace, who had spent her entire life elbowing her way through male-dominated green rooms, fighting for the right to scream as loud as any man on stage, saw him as more than a nuisance. He was a symbol, a grotesque reminder of everything the revolution hadn't fixed, a sneer at everything she'd bled for. He didn't just offend her, he enraged her, because Gene Simmons didn't just represent the problem, he profited from it. And Grace had never been one to stay silent when the truth needed a megaphone. And finally, the one name she speaks with a sharpness that cuts through decades, Ted Nugent. With Nugent, there was no gray area, only a smoldering battlefield. To Grace, he wasn't just a provocateur, he was a siren of everything she'd spent her life fighting against. A loaded weapon wrapped in a flag, masked in freedom but fueled by fear. His every word reeked of hostility toward women, toward the vulnerable, toward anyone who dared question authority. She encountered him only once, but once was enough. It was a political benefit in the 1980s, where ideals clashed harder than guitars. He approached her like he owned the room, hand out, mouth already running. Grace recoiled, not from shyness, but instinct. Her gut screamed, danger. His handshake felt like a branding iron. Then came his set. Not just loud, violent. The lyrics, the posture, the manic display of masculinity, it was all a grotesque performance of dominance. He didn't play to liberate, he played to conquer. She left mid-performance, disgust written across her face, muttering invectives reporters would never dare to print. It wasn't just the noise. It was the message, the twisted patriotism, the glorification of violence, the sneering nationalism that danced on the edge of incitement. While Grace sang for freedom, Nugent shouted for control. Her rebellion was a roar for justice. His? A growl for supremacy. To her, Nugent was the final nightmare, the result of what happens when the soul of rock is drained and replaced with rage. A rebellion gutted of purpose. A man who cloaked hate in showmanship. She never forgave him, and she never stopped warning the world. This is what happens when the revolution forgets why it began. Grace Slick was never interested in being nice. She didn't survive the psychedelic revolution by smiling and nodding. She survived it by spitting in the face of conformity, flipping tables in boardrooms, and refusing to let the men around her dictate the terms of her presence. She named names. She called out cowards. She laughed at legends and stared down icons. And she reminded the world that behind the flowers and peace signs there was a war for integrity, one she never stopped fighting. These five, they weren't just personalities she clashed with. They were emblems of a sickness she saw growing in rock. Arrogance, hypocrisy, exploitation. They failed that war. To her, they weren't enemies, they were warnings. Proof that even within a revolution, rot could set in, because in the house that rot built, Grace was never a guest. She didn't knock politely. She kicked in the door, screamed through the smoke, and lit the stage on fire, just to see who had the nerve to stay and burn with her. She wasn't there to be adored. She was there to be heard. And long after the applause faded, her voice still echoed, unfiltered and unflinching. Grace never stopped calling out the ones who tried to burn it down for the wrong reasons. And that's why her fury never faded. It evolved into a legacy that reminds every generation rebellion means nothing if it forgets who it's supposed to protect.